Hello, everyone. Welcome again to a new session of this webinar series. My name is Alan Murgis. I am a consulting reservoir engineer based here in Australia, and I'm also the founder of CrowdField, a digital hub for oil and gas subsurface pros to come together and collaborate, share knowledge, build tools, and a bit more. This webinar series is an opportunity for me to sit down with experts in their field and discuss a topic of interest. And today's session is entitled Physics and Cruft in Saturation Modeling. My guest today is Dr. Daniel J. O'Mara, 47 years of extensive experience in reservoir engineering, geological modeling, petrophysics, software development, academia, and management. He's collaborated with major oil companies, national oil companies, and independents on some of the world's largest fields. He founded and directed the Institute for Reservoir Characterization at the University of Oklahoma. At Landmark Graphics, awarded Consultant of the Year and served as Chief Advisor for Resource Estimation and Validation. He's the creator of widely used Geo2Flow and StrataSim software. He's co-authored commercial geophysical software and holds 5 patents. He's earned his PhD from Princeton University, and his early career was at Shell and BP. So it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Dan and share his wisdom with all of us today. A bit of housekeeping, guys. We have about 40 to 45 minutes for the talk and followed by 10 to 15 minutes Q&A. Dan is happy to take questions during the session if it is a quick clarification and does not take us too much away from the momentum of the talk. Please stay muted throughout the session just to reduce the noise. If you have a question, just raise your hand with the little hand icon you see at the bottom of the screen, or simply chat your question in the chat box. This session is being recorded with Dan's consent, and it will be distributed through our YouTube channel and on LinkedIn as well. With all of that out of the way, now, Dan, I'm going to enable again screen sharing and microphone, and please unmute yourself and share your screen, and the stage is yours, mate.
So wonderful to see some names I recognize from LinkedIn who I've never met. Istvan sitting in Hungary, and Jean-Marie is in Belgium, and Mark's coming in from Perth. So we have kind of a worldwide audience. Okay, the title of the talk is Physics and Cruft in Saturation Modeling. So the first thing I have to define is Cruft. So I had somebody ask me this on LinkedIn the other day, what is Cruft? Well, Cruft refers to badly designed, unnecessarily complicated, or unwanted code or software. I learned this term from one of our software engineers a number of years ago. Never heard of it myself, although I've been writing software since the 70s. So when it comes to saturation modeling, saturation height functions are Cruft. Transition zones, the concept, or flow zone indicator rock typing. These are things that are unnecessarily complicated and unwanted and badly designed for saturation modeling. So when you think of, if we step back here and you ask yourself, what's the purpose of history matching for a reservoir engineer? And a lot of engineers will say to get a match, which is kind of funny. But it's really to make better decisions on your reservoir, whether it's placement of wells or getting a production forecast or what have you. So if your model contradicts measurements or physics, then you have to think, how good are your decisions? Because engineers know there's a lot of non-uniqueness to reservoir history matching. So you can get matches by contorting things, but they're not very predictive. So one of the things you want to be able to do is make sure that you always honor your measurements. And the place we have measurements are at the wells, either logs or core. We have pressure transient well testing that samples the interwell space. We have seismic, but those are fuzzy kind of measurements. If you take a university course on capillary pressure, you'll probably encounter a plot that looks like this. So on the x-axis, we have saturation, And as you go up in the reservoir above the free water level, the saturation goes down, the water saturation goes down. And you're led to believe that that happens quite uniformly, that height is the key variable. But when you are in the industry and you're working in real reservoirs, you get the following. This is a real reservoir. So this is saturation as a function of height. So even at the very top of this reservoir where my mouse is here, we have 100% water. Okay, and you go, so the story isn't as simple as that saturation depends just on height alone. So the homogeneous reservoir assumption that you have on the left and that you get at university hardly ever applies to real reservoirs. So here's exactly the same data, plotted height versus saturation. And this plot that I'm about to show you has exactly the same data points. They've just been rearranged. So we have something called the J function, which I'll explain shortly, as a function of saturation. And you see something that reminds you of the kind of data that we see in the laboratory. But as we'll learn, the J function includes permeability. And that's outright remarkable because what this plot shows is that when you insert permeability into the function that you're using, things become far better behaved. So you can understand what's going on. So up here where my mouse is, and we have 100% water at the top of the reservoir, at the top height. Okay, we also have very poor permeability, and that explains why the water saturation is high. So the same data occurs in both plots. I want to stress that. So the J function is better behaved, but there's loss of intuition because people naturally say, well, I'm at 100 feet above the free water. I want to know what the water saturation is. And you look over here and you can say, pick a number. But over here, we see that when J is equal to 5, we're in a pretty narrow range. But the question is, where is J equal to 5? I've lost my intuition. I don't know where that occurs. And that's one of the disadvantages of using something called dimensionless numbers. Because when I tell you that the Reynolds number, when it gets to be 2100, that the flow in a pipe is going to get turbulent, you're naturally going to say, well, how big is the pipe? In other words, what's the height? Or what's the flow rate? Or what's the viscosity? Or what's the density? Okay, and it's all wrapped into one number. So the problem with dimensionless numbers is we lose intuition. By the way, Alan didn't mention that if you have questions, please feel free to ask away or put your hand up and Alan will see it. So I'm going to show you to begin with here for saturation modeling. I'm going to show you a saturation quality control plot that you can do on your reservoir models. And then we'll talk about core-derived J functions. We'll talk about getting them from logs. And then we'll look at the coupling of saturation with permeability. And then finally, I'll give you some takeaway messages and we can have a discussion. Okay. So I'm going to construct a plot. It's an easy plot to construct on any reservoir. So here we go. On the x-axis, I'm going to plot the pore volume weighted water saturation upscaled log, which is the proper way to upscale a saturation log, is to weight it with the porosity. Okay, and I'm going to plot that for all the cells in a 3D model that are intersected by wells. Those are the only place we have data for saturation in the model, unless you're doing 4D seismic. So, and on the y-axis, we're going to plot the 3D water saturation that somebody put into the cells in the 3D model. How did they put it there? Maybe cap curves, height functions, J functions, what have you. And all we're going to do is compare at the 3D cells that are penetrated by wells, what's out there for the water saturation in 3D versus what the log is telling us. Okay, and because there's no uncertainty on how to upscale saturation, it's pore volume weighted, all the data should be on the 45-degree line. So here's a plot, and when you see the plot, I want you to think about what the worst feature of this plot is. So here's the plot, and you may say, Dan, you've cherry-picked this, you've gone around the world, you've found some reservoir that's a mess. And what I can tell you is this is the kind of plot we see on practically every reservoir. There was a fellow on LinkedIn recently touting AI for reservoir history matching. And he said he could do it within a day or two. And I said, when you get your model, please send it to me. And in 5 minutes, I'll show you how it doesn't match the basic data. So on the x-axis, we have the upscaled saturation log at cells penetrated by the wells. And on the y-axis, we have the 3D saturation. And we have a 45-degree line, the black line that's diagonally here. And all the data should be on that line if things are going well. So clearly the data is not on the line, but that's not the worst part of this plot. The worst part of this plot is way up here. Somebody said the free water is at a given elevation, say minus 5,000 feet. And under that elevation in the 3D model, it's going to be 100% water. So that's why the 3D water saturation is a 1. Okay, but the well data is saying, wait a minute, we've got a log that says that we've got 95% oil, not 95% water. That's a massive contradiction. Now, the number one reason that that occurs is people have more free water levels in their reservoir than they initially think. Everybody likes to be friendly. So when you get in a meeting, it's nice to think that the free water is at, pick a number, and people will pick a number. And then we find out from the well data that it's not telling the whole story. So this plot is really diagnostic in terms of telling you what's wrong with your model. You can do it in 5 minutes. Okay, now another way of interpreting this plot is on the x-axis, we have the input from the petrophysicist. And on the y-axis, we have what the geomodeler and the reservoir engineer are going to use in history matching. So you can say that this plot demonstrates the lack of communication between the disciplines. Now, when a salesman asks me, they say, Dan, you've got software that you have in the industry. Who do we talk to about selling it? And my answer is, first go to talk to the reservoir engineers because they have budget. History matching takes up most of the budget, so they account for most of the budget. And then next, go to the geologist. And if you really have to, go to the petrophysicist because they usually don't have budget. Now, this plot tells you why the petrophysicists don't have budget. Because the petrophysics information, the data, the basic data at the wells is being ignored. Okay, so if I'm a manager, I'm thinking like, look, if we're going to ignore your data anyhow, and those wells aren't going to really count because we're going to override it with some equation that somebody got, okay, then why pay attention to the petrophysics silo? And not surprisingly, the petrophysicist gets the lowest budget. Now, don't take my word. You need to check on your own models. So a poor match says the data is not being honored at the very least. You may have compartments and the disciplines aren't communicating. For all the talk we have of integration, this plot shows you it's not happening. And how much of a difference can such errors make? Well, you can end up underestimating oil volume by 25 to 30%. I've seen that at a number of companies. And you go, wait a minute, why would it be an underestimation? Well, it turns out that when people make errors in saturation modeling, the errors aren't random. They know just enough about saturations to screw it up. And they usually screw it up in one direction. They're either underestimating systematically or overestimating systematically. My experience around the industry is it's not random. If you've got more compartments, you're going to need more wells than you expect. And that's very important if you're in the offshore because it could lead to more platforms in order to exploit the reservoir. So in the Gulf of Mexico, the number one reason to write down reserves is because of unexpected compartments. Of course, you get wasteful history matches because if the input data is not honored, you have to ask yourself, even if you've got a match, which some people have as their goal, how worth it is it if the data is not being honored? You probably just turn the crank and got a match because it's not unique. Okay, and then if you're doing EOR, end of the road, as Dake said, or expensive oil recovery, then you've got a poor understanding of your initial conditions for EOR. Okay, so you can ask yourself, like, well, Dan, you've shown this plot at company after company. How do people react? And it's not what you'd expect unless you're a psychologist. So because there's a concept called cognitive dissonance, and it describes the mental stress or discomfort experienced by an individual who's confronted by new information that conflicts with existing beliefs, ideas, or values. There's a well-known psychologist, and they asked him, what's the most depressing thing you know about human nature? And he said, once people are anchored in a particular belief, it's almost impossible to get them to change despite all evidence to the contrary. And if you haven't seen this in saturation, you've certainly seen it in your philosophical arguments or political arguments with friends. Okay? So cognitive dissonance explains what happens when people see a plot like this. They're so confused that they just move on because they can't accept that the reservoir model is as bad as what can be seen in 5 minutes to take the plot up. So the next step we're going to look at is core-derived J functions. We're going to look at what a J function means, and then we're going to look at some data. So now I'm going to use something called dimensional analysis. And for some people, this is a strange term, but it appeared in the first Society of Petroleum Engineers monograph that was written on pressure transient testing, pressure buildup and flow test in wells, written by Charlie Matthews and Don Russell. Charlie was the top technical person at Shell, and Don Russell was a vice president at Shell. And when they wrote this monograph, they employed something called a dimensionless time in order to understand pressure transient well test. So the dimensionless time puts together actually 6 variables: the permeability, the time itself, compressibility, the radius, the time, and the viscosity. And it turns out porosity is also included, and that has no units, so you don't have to do any balancing. But if you put in the units for what compressibility, perm, radius, time, and viscosity are, you see that lengths cancel out, and then mass cancels out, and then you're left with T over T squared over T, which cancels out. So this is a dimensionless quantity. Now, the remarkable thing is this dimensionless time puts 6 variables into one. So you don't have to go out there and change these variables willy-nilly independently. All you have to do to get a different result is have a dimensionless time that's different. Okay, so in saturation analysis, the way that you proceed with dimensional analysis is you write down the things that are important to you. Capillary pressure, we know, is going to be important. You remember in university, you learned how important that's supposed to be. And then, of course, we know that perm is important, and perm has units of area, surface area, so L squared. Interfacial tension, we expect interfacial tension forces to be important. That has units of mass over time squared. Porosity is unitless, and contact angle is unitless. So I could combine the 3 variables that have units, PC, K, and sigma, into one variable, PC divided by sigma, multiplied by the square root of K, and you'd see that the units balance out. Okay, so that's a dimensionless function. Now, Leverett, when he first proposed his J function back in 1941, he said he looked at the bundle of capillary tube model, which was a very simple model. He knew in 1941 that this model did not represent porous media. But it's instructive. And what he learned is anytime K turned up, the phi turned up in the denominator. So he put the phi under K under the square root. Okay, and it wasn't until a few years later that Rose and company came out with a paper and said, you know, if you're looking at mercury porosymmetry, which had just been invented in 1941 by Bob Purcell at Shell, okay, that you're going to need the contact angle. So the equation that I show here, where my mouse is what's referred to as the levered equation, although levered didn't include the contact angle. But he was wise in making a dimensionless equation. Now, he had just come out of MIT with a chemical engineering degree, so he didn't think this was a big deal. He just presented it in his paper without even making a fanfare about, here, I'm about to show you something remarkable. He just wrote it down. Okay, now, if you think about how we just went through this derivation of this equation, porosity is unitless, so we don't have to make it to the half power. That was Leverett's choice, which was a good choice, but we could generalize and take porosity to any power. And when I looked at Tomir's work of 1960 and looked at the J function applying to it, it appears that for the class of rocks that Tomir looked at, Bert Tomir was at Shell also, that that phi to the 1 power, not the half power, seems to fit his data better. Okay, but that's neither here nor there, because we can raise it to any power we want because we don't disturb the fact that it's unitless as J. So let's look at these for a North Sea gas field where the permeability is 0.02 to 400 millidarcy. So we have 5 decades of PC and J. Here's the capillary pressure data for such a field. There's about 70 or so curves on this plot. And here's the J function. So we see right away the J function is more compact, it's more well-behaved. And that's absolutely remarkable because remember, J has perm inside of it, and perm we know is very noisy. Now, as often happens with dimensionless number, there's a magic number in the system. Like if you're on an airplane, you probably looked at the television screen and said, why can't we go any faster than 550 miles per hour? And the answer is you can't exceed Mach 1, which is the speed of sound in a commercial plane, or the plane will start to fall apart, which would be very important to pilot. Okay, so it's kind of like with Mach numbers, which are dimensionless numbers, just the speed of the airplane divided by the speed of sound, is a magic number, Mach 1. In porous media, for Reynolds numbers, they have to be less than 1 to not have eddies in the flow and not have to use a Forsheimer correction for Darcy's law. So dimensionless numbers have magic numbers. And in J function analysis, you'll find that the J value hardly ever exceeds 1 at a water saturation of 1. Now, I can't say anything conclusive about capillary pressure because you can get capillary pressures that are 10,000 psi. They can be all over the place, and 10,000 psi would be a seal for the reservoir. So with J functions, like other dimensionless functions, we learned that there's a magic number in the system. Okay, now when I first came to the Middle East in the early 90s, people said, Dan, you know, J functions, they might work in clastics in the North Sea, but they certainly don't work in carbonates, you know, because when it comes to carbonates, boy, dimensional analysis just doesn't work. And you go, wait a minute, dimensional analysis should work every place. So it's like, let's look at carbonates. So here's the Costa data set, which George Costa Gomez, when he was a graduate student getting his PhD at Heriot-Watt, put together based on Middle East data. So the perm range is quite broad here. You can see 0.01 to 1,000 millidarcies. So here's the capillary pressure versus saturation. And you can see where my mouse is here, some nice bimodal rocks in the carbonates, which occur in plastics, by the way, but people tend to assume they only occur in carbonates, which is wrong. Here's the J functions, much better behaved and also not exceeding a maximum value of 1 when the water saturation is 1. Why is that important? Because if I see log-derived J function values that are up around 5 at a water saturation of 1, something is going on in the reservoir. Either I have to bring down my perm or I've got multiple compartments. Okay, now in recent years in the United States, for the Costa data set, I wanted to mention that here it's color-coded by FCI, which is the square root of perm divided by porosity over porosity divided by 1 minus the porosity. And that comes out of the Karman-Kozani equation. A group of people from Core Labs came up with this back in the 80s. Okay, so here's the color coding of capillary pressure, and you see a nice trend. You see low values of FCI at the very top for low quality rock, and then the FCI values get progressively increasing as you get to the better quality rock. And people put these kind of plots up all the time, and they're completely and utterly worthless, because here's the J function plot here, and the color coding is also by FCI, and you can see some of the best FCI is at the top here, and some of the worst FCI is at the bottom. So why is that? It's because the J function already includes the square root of K over phi. Now, what's hilarious is when people use FCI to type J functions, they try to color code J functions by FCI. So first of all, you can see no trend. But worst of all, they're using a dimensional quantity, FCI, which has units of micron or meters, okay, to type something that's dimensionless. Now that just shows they don't know anything about dimensional analysis, okay? So, but you'll see that in the literature, which is just amazing. Now, in the United States, it turns out we're very interested in unconventionals. We produce a lot of oil nowadays from unconventional reservoirs. So here, I'm going to show you capillary pressure data for 9 nanodarcy rock, okay, up to 89 microdarcy. So here's the raw data, and you can see that we've got entry values here that exceed 10,000 psi. For most of you, that's a seal in the reservoir that prevents flow, okay? But this is your rock that we produce by fracturing in the United States. Here are the J functions. Now, if I showed you the J functions first, you'd go, wait a minute, that looks like a homogeneous North Sea reservoir. And no, that's down to 6 nanodarcy. And the rule, amazingly enough, still applies. The maximum value of J is equal to 1 isn't exceeded at a water saturation of 1. Okay, so think about what you just saw. The J functions are well behaved despite the fact that they include permeability. So on the Costa data set, here's your poroperm cross plot. So this is your typical carbonate cross plot. You get a band here, but at any one porosity like 0.2, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude difference in perm. And yet the J functions with that perm are better behaved than if you have capillary pressure curves. That's the power of dimensional analysis. It's counterintuitive, I grant you, okay? But that's something you just have to get used to. So the rule of thumb here is that J doesn't exceed 1 at a water saturation of 1. We see that over and over and over again for laboratory data. So, and that's typical of a dimensionless number like a Reynolds number. And we're going to learn that log-derived J functions, why not, follow the same rule. So now we move on to discussing log-derived J functions. So for log-derived J functions, we write down the levered function, and we notice that the capillary pressure in the reservoir is delta rho, the density difference between the water and the oil or gas, gravity times elevation minus a very sacred place called the free water elevation, which is identically where PC is equal to 0. That's how you get PC in the reservoir. Now, engineers know that the density doesn't just stay constant, so you can take into account in this equation compositional effects, okay? That's just a complication. Now, in the reservoir, we get the porosity and the water saturation from logs. The permeability we'd like to get from a log. Some people try to get it from the NMR log, but usually they get it from a correlation or a neural net, and they put together a perm log. Now, the people who do saturation height say, my functions don't have perm in them. And you go, okay, that's non-physical. You're going to learn that perm's important, because if you look at that plot that I showed you to begin with, at the top of the reservoir, we have 100% water, and it's because the perm is low. Now they're going to say, well, I have a different rock type. But then what happens is they get hundreds of rock types in a simulation. We had one simulation in the Middle East, had 101 rock types in it. You know, I got to be kidding here, because no geologist would support that. Usually engineers say too many rock types to the geologist. Okay, but 101, You got to be kidding me. Okay, so this is how we get looking at log functions. So here's log-derived data where we've plotted the height above the free water of the data versus saturation on the log. Okay, and we go, wait a minute, we've got high water saturation high up in the reservoir, and we've got low water saturation right down near the free water. What is going on here? So here's the J function data replotted. Remember, J includes perm. Okay, and the high water saturation at the top of the reservoir is just low perm, low values of J. And the low water saturation, low in the reservoir, is intermediate values of J. It never gets too high because of the height, but it gets high because of the perm. Okay, so it's kind of like, can you find the transition zone here? Maybe in J space you can, but remember your intuition goes haywire. But over here on the left, where's the transition zone? It's kind of all over the place. And that's why transition zone is Cruft. You need to get rid of it. It doesn't tell you what's going on. You need to be plotting J functions. Okay, so the variable saturations here are largely due to perm, which is just as important as height. Okay, now I'm going to show you a plot here. This shows 3 smooth J functions from laboratory data. Everything I've seen in the lab fits within those 3 J functions. And the dots are log data. So how do I get the data? Well, saturation's on the x-axis, so saturation log, and J I get because I know the elevation of the data in the log above an assumed free water, okay? And I know the perm and porosity from logs. So we're going to watch here as I'm going to circle some points that seem to be outliers, and we're going to see that when I change the free water of these points here, watch what happens. The color coding by well. So the red well suddenly seems to be singing a different song than the other 2, which are at a free water 2970. So I put the red well back on, which would seem to be the outlier, and I start to drop the free water on it. J values become larger. And this data that seemed to be in the red circle and not making sense makes perfect sense at a free water of 3120. This is a reservoir, only 3 wells, 2 compartments, okay? So in general, people talk about contacts as if they're flat. They say the contact's at minus 5,000. And that's just simply wrong. Because if I look at a smooth J function here and assume a single free water, the equation for the contact looks like this, that J is equal to delta rho G, the elevation of the contact minus the free water, square root of K over phi, interfacial tension contact angle. Now, the contact occurs right here where my mouse is, where I'm circling, where we first got non-wetting phase oil or gas entering the reservoir. So how big JD is, it's 0.4. So for 0.4 to be kept constant, if K over phi is varying in the reservoir, which it always is, then the key takeaway here is that the Z of the contact minus Z of the free water must vary in order to keep JD equal to 0.4 if square root of K over phi is varying. So contacts are not flat. And in the next picture, you see this. Here, for instance, is 4 free waters are in white. But look how high you have to go up above the free water to get to any oil in the reservoir. That's the difference between a contact, which is highly variable in this case, versus free waters where there are only 4. But 4 is a lot more than most people have. Most people like 1 contact. Thank you. Okay, so the next thing here is to couple the saturation with perm because it's natural to do so. J functions teach us that. So here's that data that has been reconciled to 2 different free waters. Okay, and we're going to have to reconcile the rest of the data here that's not seeming to fit. And over on this plot here, we're going to show you the perm that was the input perm and the output perm. And you'll see that the color coding on the perm plot is going to be blue, showing that at high water saturations, which are denoted by blue, the perm has to come down to get the data inside the J functions. But sometimes, like this point here where my mouse is, it's easier to change the irreducible than it is to change the perm. So let's look what happens here when we run the video. The data gets reconciled by changing the perm by a bit. So notice before and after here, and the changes in the perm. Now the irreducible gets changed a bit, but it's rather small. Okay, the main driver here is the perm for high water saturations. So now it turns out if geologists were to cross-plot perm and porosity, they'll often use a semi-log fit, which is the log of K is equal to a constant plus another constant times porosity. That's a semi-log linear fit. And if I just take the equation and upscale it and take a volume average of both sides, on the right-hand side, I get a volume average of porosity, which we know and love, and we use in Petrel or your geological modeling package every day of the week by geologists. But on the other side of the equation, we get something not expected. We get a volume average of not the perm, but the logarithm of the perm. So here's the nice thing. We get the same equation after we've upscaled. Most people imagine that all hell breaks loose when you upscale, that all bets are off. Okay, but it turns out the equation is exactly the same if the rock type doesn't change within a cell. Okay, say we're upscaling a cell in the 3D model. But we have to understand that we're not getting an average perm, we're getting the average of the log. So geometric averaging, the geometric perm is an average of the logarithms, is best for upscaling permeability for J functions because the equation stays the same. That's not the case for arithmetic averaging. So we're going to use that insight. If I have flow between two cells, K1 and K2, and the flow is from left to the right, the average permeability of this system is this equation, K average, where N is equal to 1, is H1K1, H2K2 over the sum of the H's. That's if flow from left to right. If the flow is straight up, then either one of K1 or K2 being 0 is a showstopper. And in that case, it's the same equation, but N is equal to -1. That's called the harmonic average. That 1 over K average is H1 over K1, H2 over K2 over the sum of the H's. But what did we just say that we did when we upscaled from the laboratory poro-perm cross-plot? We got the geometric average, which is always less than the arithmetic if you're in heterogeneous reservoirs, and always greater than harmonic. Of course, if you're homogeneous, all the averages are the same. So here, for instance, it's the difference between the geometric average, which we're going to use for J function upscaling, and the horizontal or arithmetic average. You can see it's more than a factor of 10 in some instances here in the reservoir. So this explains why the geologist gives the engineer the geometric average, and the engineer uses phrases like this. This is what I heard in a meeting in the Middle East. If I use your perm, I can't get my reservoir to flow. It's that bad, okay? And so there can be a big difference between these averages, and that has to be recognized. So and here's the harmonic average. Okay, so which perm are you using for history matching? Well, the engineer wants the arithmetic average for flow in later media, but for J functions, we want the J perm. And there are simulators out there now, Eclipse and Intersect and T-Navigator, which allow you to control the perm that you're going to use for J function analysis. It's called the J perm, and it means that you get a choice other than KX, KY, KZ, which are traditionally the only ways that you could do J function work in a simulator. So ever had to boost your perm by a factor of 5 or more? No surprises, because the engineer is using the wrong perm. He's getting a perm that was created based on the best fit of the logarithm of the perms. Okay, so takeaway messages here. We're coming up on a half an hour. Always use physics-based dimensionless functions. Okay, you lose intuition, but so what? Get used to it. Okay, you gain so much more when you use dimensionless functions. So Nancy Reagan, many years ago, her solution to drugs in the United States was to just say no. So just say no to saturation hype models. When you see them, say no. they're actually dimensionally incorrect. They're inconsistent. So you should be using J functions. Permeabilities and saturation are coupled, so you need to take advantage of that. You need to learn about perm from saturation. If the saturation's 1, high up above the free water, you've got low perm. And if your model's not saying that, there's something wrong with your perm log. And where did you get the perm log? From a very noisy correlation or neural net. So there's plenty of room to change the perm, and these two things need to be modeled together. If you entitle yourself, I'm the saturation height modeler, you've just announced your ignorance about modeling perm and saturation together. Transition zone, confusing, throw it away. Okay, FCI, it adds nothing to J-function analysis. A lot of times engineers will say, I've done rock typing. When you probe and just go a little bit deeper, you find out all they've done is rearranged square root of K and phi. They're still using K and phi. They're not talking about facies, lithofacies, any kind of geological term, diagenesis, texture, anything like that. That's all thrown out. They condense it to manipulating K and phi. And of course, you must match all your 3D saturations to your upscale log. So here's the new best practice. You do this, you go in, and every one of your models in your company, you look at this plot. And it's very important here. This plot's at the cell scale of resolution. A lot of petrophysicists will do this plot at half-foot intervals in their log and convince themselves their height functions are doing just fine, thank you. They're 101 height functions like in one model. Okay, but you have to do it at the cellular scale of resolution because that's what the engineer's using in his history match. He's not using half-foot cells. And this is what's required. And when we do this kind of stuff, we actually show you the points that are off the curve, and they are due to discretization errors that occur right at the contact where you have cells that have 100% water up to a certain point in the cell, and then they change over to less than 100%. So now, as I said, cognitive dissonance is a very big reason why people don't change their minds. So there's an old joke. How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is just one. But the light bulb must really want to change. So the question is, do you want to change? Okay, so I'm open now for questions.
Thank you, Dan. It's 2 times thank you from me. The audience should know that we had this session a couple of weeks ago, so it's my privilege to have listened to this twice. I'm just going to open straight away the session for questions. Guys, if you want to grab the mic, just hit that hand icon and unmute yourselves and take it away.
Okay, I'll go first. I was wondering, Dan, if you could go back to one of your first images, the one that you showed the 3D versus the petrophysical, the 3D SW versus the petrophysical 3D.
Oh, okay. So let's see here. Let me go back to sharing my screen. And so let's see. Which slide is it? Do you see it in the list on the left here?
Yeah, it's a bit higher than that. Yeah.
Oh, this one here?
That's the one.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I was wondering, in fact, it's even higher than that because it actually shows 3D. Go a little higher. I think it's one of your earlier slides. No, even higher than that.
Oh, no, I've run out of room.
Okay. Yeah, then it's that one. Okay, so you've got the on the y-axis, you've got the geomodeling, which I assume was done with the saturation height function. Is it right?
That is worldwide what a lot of people use. Yes, saturation height function. So that's a perfect example of cognitive dissonance at play.
Okay, and the different colors, what do they represent?
Well, in this case, they happen to be wells.
Okay. Because, you know, if you're doing a upscale of your SW from the logs into the cell that intersects the log, you should have a pretty good match. So I would have expected some of the points to be along your 45-degree line, which is exactly where the well is. But
Jean-Marie, you've obviously missed the fact that look at all this data along the 45-degree line. Like
that's why I'm actually stunned by that. I've seen it many times, and you've shown it many times. And
well, here's the thing, Jean-Marie. What I want is, you know, when people see a plot like that, they'll say, Dan, you've cherry-picked it. You found that one field in the entire world that has a plot this bad. And I can tell you, I've never seen a plot that isn't like this. It's startling. And the reason that people don't get worried is they never plot the data this way because, you know, it's one of these things you have to get it exactly right or it's wrong. And when I say you plot the upscaled saturation log, you have to pore volume weight it. So, you know, Petrel didn't even do that until a few years ago. They didn't make it easy for the geologist or engineer. And then you compare it to what they have in the 3D cell, as you point out, usually done with saturation equations. You know, I was in one Middle Eastern company where the petrophysicist said, of course, we're integrated. We do everything in integration and fashion, you know? And the chief geologist spoke up and he said, bloody hell, we're not integrated. You send me the height functions by email. And I have to take those functions out of the email and put them into Petrel to get your saturation. That's how unintegrated we are. You know, so it's kind of like this kind of plot happens every place. I encourage people to do it on their fields. Go ahead, Jean-Marie.
And of course, you know, the very top one where you say, you know, the geomodeling is putting one. I've got a feeling that somebody did a truncation and said that anything that is less than a certain porosity, for instance, is non-reservoir. So we'll just give it SW. But it's scary to see a plot like that. And as I said, you've shown it many times.
Well, you know what's more fun is when I go to an oil company and, you know, people come into the room with their arms folded. It's kind of like they're doing height functions. They don't want to change their ways. And I put up this plot, not a generic plot like you're seeing. I put up a plot on their field, the field they're working on. And what happens is around the room, you'll actually hear people saying, it's not that bad, is it? It's really not that bad, is it? And they're having cognitive dissonance. They're trying to convince themselves that their field cannot be this bad. But the story is, it really is.
It usually is, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's really remarkable. Mark, did you have a question?
Well, I maybe I've missed the message of one of the fundamental messages of your talk, and there's you're saying replace saturation height with saturation J function. Is that right?
Yes, of course.
Okay. No, I got that right. Okay, good.
Mark, in a half an hour talk, I have to make the message very simple.
Very simple. Yeah, that's great if you can. Yeah. What else? I'll have something else in a minute. Just let me go through the notes I've made. Go ahead. Anybody else?
Yeah, we got a question from Abiola. Take it away, mate.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Can I be Ed?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear, Abiola.
Yeah, thank you very much for this session. I just want to confirm something from you. Most times, when we are trying to use the data from the petrophysics, for example, maybe I'm giving the height above free water level and the saturation, and I want to generate my, most especially, I want to find my capillary pressure. So you show one formula, just want to be sure. So in that way, how do we get the capillary pressure? Let's say we don't have the SCAR data. So how do we get the capillary pressure? Is it good to actually use that formula you showed? Because most times we don't scale it down to the J function. Just to confirm. Thank you.
So that's a great question, because in some parts of the world, like if I'm working in Latin America, okay, I'm lucky to have any core data whatsoever on a reservoir. Okay. So it's kind of like that. Here's the wonderful thing with capillary pressure, you don't know what to do. But if you've got J functions, they're incredibly well behaved. Remember, they don't exceed 1 at a water saturation of 1. They fall in a narrow band. You can actually get J functions that are applicable for, say, Nigeria, and so a lot of your fields will fall within a really narrow band in J space. And then you can pick up those J functions on analog fields, if you will, for the field that doesn't have any information. And it's really remarkable how well they behave. And it puts you in the ballpark for seeing and understanding the patterns that you'll see when you have log-derived J functions. So like if I showed you this plot here, remember the plot I had of challenging you to try to see the transition zone. If you just look at this, height versus saturation, you don't see anything. But imagine that the smooth curves are not on the plot on the left. Could you discern the J function? It's really easy to see, right? So it's kind of like, and so that's the virtue of dimensionless numbers. Like if you have a pipe in Nigeria, it's going to go turbulent flow at 2100 Reynolds number, whether it's in Nigeria or Perth or the United States, or it doesn't matter, okay? Because world around, 2100 is the magic number for turbulence in a pipe, okay? So world around, you don't exceed a 1 for water saturation. So if I see data way up here where my mouse is in a J function log-derived plot, I know something's wrong. I must have the perm is off. Where'd I get the perm? From a correlation. I may have different compartments. If I saw a trend up here that came in at a J is equal to 5, I've got a different compartment because the perm couldn't be uniformly off by a factor of 25 in the entire reservoir. It probably signals compartments. And these things are so easy to pick out on J function plots. So if you're in a situation where you don't have data, you still plot the log-derived J functions and you'll see the patterns. Does that answer your question, Abiola?
Yes. But one more question, right? So let's say I don't have the capillary pressure now, right? So I'm just asking, there's one formula you show. I don't know if it's advisable to go with that because you actually showed that I think that yeah, exactly, yeah. So this one. So I don't know, is it advisable to go with this formula?
Well, think about it. In the reservoir, the capillary pressure for cases where you don't have compositional effects changing the density too much. And remember, every single saturation height model has a delta rho that's a constant. They don't even talk about it. Okay, so it's kind of like delta rho, you have the density difference between your two fluids in the reservoir. You know what gravity is, and you know the elevation of a point on the log compared to an assumed free water. Now you can just ballpark the free water. You saw when I went in there and changed the log-derived J functions, I get a nice looking J shape when I set the free water at 2940 for 2 of those wells. And it's kind of like you learn about the free water that way. And what's remarkable is this is a second way, an independent way of checking your free water against pressure data. Because anybody who looks at pressure data knows that pressure data is incredibly noisy because it can be depleted, it's supercharged, bad test. And so real data looks noisy. And it's sometimes hard to discern the intersection of the oil line and the water line. And Lord help you, if you don't have a water line. In a lot of reservoirs, you don't have a water line. So it's kind of like you're really guessing about the free water. Whereas when you look at J function plots, the free water just jumps out at you. So it's an independent way using just saturations and logs of getting your free water over and above pressure data, which is the traditional way that engineers get it. And sometimes noise, I worked on a field in China where they had 1,000 faults in the model. They didn't have 1,000 compartments. They had more like 55 compartments. But a lot of those compartments were attributable. They thought they had one happy compartment because every time they saw something that was noisy on the pressure log, they said that's noise in the pressure. They didn't realize that all those little noisy things were adding up to 55 compartments that we saw independently on J functions. I worked on a field in Alaska, second largest field in the United States, Kuparik, where they had 1,100 wells and were intersecting virgin reservoir, never saw pressure communication on the 1,100 well. And the reason, they had more than 100 compartments in the reservoir. It was really easy to see on J-function plots. We just notched one compartment after another as we went around the 1,100 wells, okay? But you don't see that when you're looking at pressure plots. You'll start to homogeneize the reservoir. You'll think that there's not many compartments out there when there truly are. Now, in clastic reservoirs, the compartments are driven by faults usually. So you want to look at the fault blocks in the Petrel model. In carbonates, the faults are often transmissive, but what happens, you have anhydrite streaks that separate reservoirs that people amalgamate into one free water. That's dead wrong. And you can see these reservoirs independently on J functions. Okay.
Dan, could you come back a few slides up from where you are currently? I think that one. Yeah. So when you move to the J saturation space, things collapse into a narrow range quite nicely, right? But
Yeah.
you still have a band there. It's not a single curve, you have a band. So for the same J value, you have a range of possible saturations. Let's say at J1, you have somewhere between 20 and 50% saturation. So the question that I have for you is, could you expand a little bit on how is your workflow to take this, once you've narrowed down everything to the J saturation space, and take this back to the reservoir, because we need to end up with a saturation grid at the end of the day, right? So how is your process to break this band down into a subset of J curves, perhaps? That's the J fascist concept you introduced.
That's right.
How do you map that out in the 3D space? So what is the J fascist association with the individual J curves to take this down to the reservoir?
Okay, so first of all, we have the concept of J fasces. So like a geologist talks about fasces, I know what J fasces is. If I look at these curves right here, I can probably get by with like 3 or 4 curves to describe my whole reservoir. And then there's going to be a little bit of noise between those curves. So you could think of a top curve here and a bottom curve, and everything in between is just going to be parameterized by a noise variable that, let's call it the bracket value. Okay, and so the bracket value says where you are between those curves, because you're right, Alan, to point out, if you're at a J of like 2, where my mouse is, you can see here that I've got a saturation range of 15% up to 35%. So I haven't told the whole story when we have a J function. Okay, so you would first of all regularize things by casting everything into J space. And now all we're going to talk about is a geostatistical variable that says whereabouts in that J space am I going to be? So you could parameterize and say everything on the lowest curve is a 0, everything on the top curve is a 1. And now I've got a geostatistical variable I can put between the wells that goes between 0 and 1 that tells me where I am in J space. Now, here's the thing, we've done that. So here's what happens. A lot of data in J space shows up down here at the bottom where you're at low values of J. You would never want that data to be the tail that wags the dog, because in this case, your oil column is at high values of J. So what we do is that bracket value, before we distribute it in 3D, we bin it. So you want to have different bins up at the top here, because at the top, you're going to want to be using the middle J functions, say in this case, but down here at the bottom, maybe all your data falls on the outer J function. So you'd not want to look at it and say, I've got 10,000 points in my well. I think I'll take the J function that's the most abundant in the data set and use that for my height function in my Petrel model, because that would weight things towards the worst J function. So that geostatistics that goes on there is kind of the subject of another lecture. Because as I mentioned to Mark, it's kind of like I'm trying to cover a few messages in a half an hour talk, and you've actually probed under the surface here and said, Dan, are you just going with 4 or 5 J functions? The answer is yes, we are. And we're going to use that geostatistical variable to do the tuning. And what that turns out to, in effect, is to control the J perm that goes to the simulator. Remember that geometric average perm that is not KX, KY, KZ? That gives us enough control to get the saturations matching the well data precisely. So in every simulation model, you want to tell the petrophysicist, I'm matching precisely your logs. Now, he may not believe his logs. So then he's going to come at you with, say, a half a dozen logs. And then you're going to discover the uncertainty due to the petrophysics by running volumes on all those logs. Because typically a petrophysicist said, I varied RGM&N over this range, or I varied the water resistivity because I was unsure of it. So he knows there's uncertainty in his silo. The problem is that uncertainty never gets out of the silo. And all the talk is about M&N and RW. And it's like managers don't react to that. Managers react to volumes. If you say the difference in the reservoir is so many billion versus 1.5 versus 1 billion barrels, they get that. They know what that means. That's very intuitive. So we have to take every petrophysical interpretation and run it through to volumetrics. We don't leave the discussion with RGM&N and RW. We don't allow it to stay there. Every petrophysical interpretation needs to be brought forth to volumes because that's the only thing the manager understands. And that explains why petrophysicists don't get the budget because managers don't understand how bloody important it is.
Yeah, I'm just wary of the time. I want to give the word to Fabio, who has his hand up. I just wanted to say, Dan, you and I spoke offline, and perhaps there will be a follow-up session with a little bit more of a hands-on, actually going on the software itself to demonstrate the workflow. So just keep an eye out, guys. There could be a follow-up session with Dan to go in more detail through the workflow. Fabio?
That will be with people who are not suffering cognitive dissonance. Because the people who are suffering dissonance will come away from this presentation and go, yeah, but I'm going back to saturation height. They will continue to use saturation height function. Okay, so we'll have a smaller audience for that presentation.
That's going to be a hard name to dislodge there, Dan. That's a very established name.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Fabio, take it away.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Dan, for your presentation. Very nice. I guess it's not the first time I just seen, and I want to change, but still, I guess pieces that are not very clear to me. One question, I have two questions. One about the one you were discussing of the J function. I will imagine like if you use say 3-4 J functions for a field, you may use them to change them area wise, like depends on, let's say I have 4 wells, so I use, depends on the area of the well, that J function.
So Fabio, excellent question. So here's the thing. Do not try to type J functions by FCI. That's one of the messages because FCI has something that's already in J, square root of K over phi. So here's what you have to do. Are you an engineer?
A geoscientist.
Geoscientist. Well, geoscientists know that there are ways of characterizing rock that have to do with more than square root of K over phi. Yep. But you guys get intimidated into using square root of K over phi when you're bringing more information to the table. If you say you're in Norway and you start talking about facies, I'm all ears because in Norway, the facies can be discriminators for J functions. You can narrow down the range of J functions with facies. Yeah. Now in carbonates, that may not be the case, okay? But it's kind of like in every Petrel model, every geological model has zone as something out there in the model. You get it for free. Every geologist gives you zone. Check and see if the J functions change zone by zone, because what it's telling you is the rock fabric is changing. I showed you the carbonate J functions, and I mentioned that they were bimodals. If you have bimodals, that means you have secondary pore systems that don't allow water to flow easily. That's bloody important to the engineer because that says the water doesn't flow to the well. We had wells in Tunisia with a field 70% water saturation on the well, flowed dry oil. No hint of water at 70% water saturation. Now, how do we understand that? Geologists said, oh, nummulites. We've got fossils there that are containing the water. And it's kind of like, okay, so the key was talk to the geologist. Duh, what a message. Talk to the geologist, huh? But I can tell you that if I talk to engineers in the Middle East, particularly, and they say the word rock type, they mean FCI.
Yeah,
They have
yeah.
not talked to the geologist. They've gone into their simulator using FCI. And that is a bloody shame because some of the countries in the Middle East do a remarkably good job of characterizing the rocks geologically speaking. And that never finds its way into the simulation. And that's horrible. So Fabio, second question.
Okay, brilliant. Just to summarize, so changing it by sun or by phases can be just one way to go, right?
Yes.
And the second question was like, you were showing the log-derived J function, like it was saturation against J function with three
Yes.
wells. I guess you were changing the head above the head of the free water level. Just
That's
to
correct.
show where it goes.
So what I showed there is when I made the free water on this plot shallower and went to 2940 meters, that the red well turned out to be an outlier. You noticed it tended to drop below zero on the J function plot and had a shape of an inverted J function. That's a key to finding compartments. When you see an inverted shape, okay, that's your compartmentalization going on. And you see how easy it was to see that. But if you look at the pressure data for this reservoir, it's noisy and there's no water pressure data. So what do you do about finding the intersection line of the water and the gas in this reservoir? It's like you're out of luck, okay? But with the log-derived J function, we see a lot of reservoirs. I'm working on a field now in Australia, and it's kind of like they're saying, well, they can't discern the free waters. We looked at it in J space, wham, they're there. You know, you see them very easily. It's because they just weren't looking at the right kind of data. They were looking at the pressure data and the pressure was noisy. But we see that happen all the time.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Fabio? Oh, you're muted. You're muted. We can see your mouth moving, but you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so you just forget the pressure data and start to change the free water level and come the pressure, the capillary pressure with that change, and then you will see that trend.
Okay, somebody's going to come away from this and say, O'Mara said, forget the pressure data. I didn't say that. Okay. What I did say is the best of the world is when you have pressure data singing the same song as the saturation data. When that happens, you know you've figured out the free waters. And when you've done that, you probably figured out the free waters to within several meters. So if you're in the Middle East, for instance, a lot of the reservoirs are very long and flat. So a couple of meters of free water could put a lot of oil in the tank. Okay, so when you talk about uncertainty, you should be looking at that kind of uncertainty, which people often underestimate, you know, because it can be hundreds of millions of barrels per couple of meters. You know, because I say people study uncertainty, they're comfortable on study. So, you know, as a geoscientist, you can go in and do 1,000 realizations of porosity and petrel, and you feel very good because you've done 1,000 realizations and you've studied uncertainty. And then you drill the next well and it's 50 feet off the top of the reservoir. And you go, whoa, wait a minute, where was that uncertainty in my model? And the answer is it wasn't there because you studied the uncertainty you were comfortable studying. What we do here is we get you out of your comfort zone where you're going to experience, wait for it, cognitive dissonance.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Okay, I think that is a good place to stop, guys. We're nearly 15 minutes past. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Thank you for the engaging questions. The Q&A was awesome this time. Thank you, Dan, once again for the second session. Thank you for giving us the time and share your presentation, your wisdom with us. Guys, stay tuned for the follow-up session with Dan, and you'll receive an email with the recording of this very session, and we can continue the discussion with Dan on LinkedIn as well.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Dan.
you, guys.
Thanks very much. Thanks for
Thanks, everyone.
organizing it.
That's great. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.